So, Mike Wood.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I shall be very brief. My father was a constable with West Midlands Police for 29 years, much of it stationed in the Honourable Gentleman, the member for Perry Barr's constituency, working in Aston and Handsworth and some challenging parts of the city at a particularly challenging time in the late 70s, the early 80s. Now, an awful lot has changed about policing in the time since he retired. But one thing that is still the case is that stop and search remains a vital tool for combating the scourge of serious violence, for keeping people safe. And we don't need to hear politicians saying that. I mean, the public know that that's a matter of common sense. The police know it to be true. Deputy Chief Constable Adrian Hanstock, the National Police Chief's lead for stop and search, said, the authority to stop and search people in appropriate circumstances is a necessary power that allows police officers to tackle violence in our communities and prevent people from becoming victims of crime. Everyday officers across the country seize horrifying weapons and are preventing further injuries and deaths by using their search powers. Now, my honourable friend, the member for West Bromwich East, has referred to various parts of the Police and Crime Commissioner's crime plan for 2021 to 2025. I think the Commissioner is right in one regard. Clearly, stop and search, it is an intrusive process. But I think at the scale of interventions open to the police, it is very much at the lesser scale of intrusion. It does still need to be balanced with the impact it has both on the individuals who are stopped and searched, also, of course, on the wider community, on perceptions of policing, on perceptions of fairness. Clearly, we need to make sure that those powers are being used appropriately, as the Deputy Chief Constable had said, that certain individuals or certain groups of individuals aren't being repeatedly targeted and stopped on a scale that almost becomes harassment. But my fear is that the kind of language that the Police and Crime Commissioner for the West Midlands has used in his plan sends out a signal to the many, many hard-working constables and officers that we have working in our communities, and particularly our neighbourhood policing teams across the West Midlands. The stop and search is something to be extremely nervous of, to only do if you've almost seen the person carrying the knife around the town centre. You have to have such a high level of certainty. When the Commissioner writes in his plan that if searches are based on a reasonable suspicion of finding something or some other action following, then at least half would need to generate a positive outcome. This is not the case. Now, that test of 50% of positive searches is not one that is generally shared by practising barristers, practising criminal solicitors. It's certainly not one that I think is shared by the majority of police officers. And yet the Police and Crime Commissioner, putting this in his formal plan for the police force area, I think introduces such a note of caution that in circumstances where an officer believes and has good grounds to believe that an individual may be carrying an offensive weapon in our streets, our town centres, our communities, our pubs, then they're more likely to be inclined to avoid stopping and searching than they are to carry out a stop and search that, even if it did only produce a positive result in 20% of cases, that could be a significant number of harm avoided and indeed lives lost. Now, the question of proportionality is, of course, central to how appropriate the measures are. Now, inevitably, if these powers are being used properly and they're being used in the areas with high crime rates, then clearly, as the Deputy Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police Force, Sir Stephen Howes, has said, inevitably there will be certain groups that are statistically far more likely to be stopped and searched in high crime areas of the city than if they were stopping and searching people in St James's Park, the outer edges of the police force area, and the same applies in the West Midlands. We know there are some parts of the West Midlands region that have far higher levels of crime. We also know that the reality is if you were taking a random sample in those areas, you would find that on a demographic level, on an ethnicity level, on a socio-economic level, certain groups would be much more likely to be stopped more often than if you were doing similar, a similar exercise in the streets of Pedmore in Dudley, or perhaps parts of Meriden. So we need to make sure that, I say, these powers aren't being used discriminatory, but we have to make sure that our police are comfortable and confident exercising these powers where they're needed, where they do feel that they have good and solid reasons to think that an individual may be carrying a weapon, and that they will have people's backing. They will have decision-makers backing, politicians backing, and sadly, I think that the comments that the Police and Crime Commissioner has made, some of the sections of this plan damage that confidence. I think they threaten to make our region less safe, and I hope that he will reconsider, edit his plan. Sorry, of course.
I'm very giving way. On that very last point about making the region less safe, the simple facts are, as resources have substantially diminished for the police service, crime has risen. Can I ask the honourable gentleman, therefore, will he be joining together with fellow Tory colleagues and Labour colleagues to make strong representations to government to restore the cuts that have been made to our police service since 2010?
The honourable gentleman will be very aware that I have a long history of pushing ministers, of arguing private and indeed in this chamber for greater funding and for changes in the funding formula to benefit West Midlands Police. I shall continue to do so. I know that a number of my colleagues will continue to do so. But I would remind him, and I think it probably slipped his mind, when I was making that argument on the precept 5 years ago, I think as Shadow Minister he attacked me, my honourable friend, the member for Solihull, for calling for council tax hikes because we were backing the Police and Crime Commissioner's call for a £5 increase in the precept for policing. I think we do need a good level of funding. I think we've had, obviously, increased funding going into the West Midlands. We're having the increased number of officers in the West Midlands. I think under the previous Police and Crime Commissioner in the West Midlands, he failed to translate that into safer streets and safer communities. And I am hoping, I genuinely wish the new Commissioner well. We need him to succeed. We need him to improve policing and safety in our region. But what I fear is he is making the same mistakes as his predecessor, and our constituents deserve better.